what was like the specific Lutheran contribution to the transition to independence? Was there something that would have been missing if the Lutherans hadn't been there, um, or something that the UN itself could not provide?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I guess I would say that there were perhaps three special contributions that the Lutherans made that were unique. One, of course, was the fact that half the people are Lutheran, and that you had the churches there being one of the few, and actually the Namibian churches were the only nationwide institution that had not been battered down by the apartheid system, which, of course, that system sought to divide people not only on the basis of race, but on the basis of tribe and ethnicity. And yet the churches brought people together, and were an important institution in that way. Then I think the second contribution was the theological one, and particularly in reaction to the Nazi time in Germany and to the way in which many Lutherans in Germany, but elsewhere too, had sort of colluded with the fascists and with the Nazis. You had a reaction then after World War II within Lutheran circles, based partly on the theological reflections of Bonhoeffer but of others as well. And the reaction was, well, how can we look into our own theological heritage and try to lift up those parts which are healthy and good, and try to make sure that these horrible things don't happen again elsewhere. And that type of theological reflection was quite important, I think, for the Lutherans in Namibia, as they looked at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as they looked at the two kingdoms theory of Luther and tried to understand that in a way where the church also has something to say to the kingdom of the left hand, and to hold government accountable for abiding by people's human rights. It was quite interesting in the seminary in Namibia in the late 60s and early 70s. There was quite a bit of study of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then the young Namibian pastors and theologians compared the situation that they were experiencing in Namibia against what was considered to be universally accepted human rights, and they saw the discrepancy there. And coming out of that discrepancy, then they the Namibian churches issued a very important statement in 1971, shortly after the International Court of Justice opinion about Namibia. And they said in that statement that despite the call in Romans 13 to obey the authorities, that the authorities there in Namibia were not ruling Namibia in a just and God-pleasing way, but rather, and the evidence then was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but rather they were abusing their privilege as the rulers in this way and this way and this way and this way. And that open letter in 1971, I think, was when the struggle for independence in Namibia was won. Everyone knew from then on that there was no moral justification for the continued South African occupation of Namibia, just as the International Court of Justice had said there was no legal justification for that occupation. And so after 1971, it was only a matter of time as to how long the occupation would last. And it was the church leaders who really gave that, church leaders and pastors who really gave that theological and moral underpinning to the cause for independence. And then the third special contribution of the Namibian churches came during the time of the transition to independence. The United Nations Transitional Assistance Group in Namibia, UNTAG, they needed local partners to work with in Namibia on a political side, to have who to talk to, how to understand the situation in Namibia, how to prepare for the elections, how to prepare for the Constituent Assembly and the transition to independence. But also on a very practical side, they needed buildings, they needed places where the UN staff around the country could have their offices or the infrastructure within which to operate. And particularly in the northern part of Namibia, the churches provided the only institution and only buildings and infrastructure and so forth, aside from that of the South African occupation. So there was a very close relationship between the UN Transitional Assistance Group in Namibia and the churches there. And in fact, I don't think the transition could have been a success if it had not been for the cooperation of the churches with the UN and that very close partnership.
And your work in Namibia itself, who were the people you were talking to, or the key players there?
Sure. I'll talk then about the year of transition to independence. And during that time, my accountability was to the Lutheran bishops, to Bishop Dumaney and to Bishop Frederick. Also, though, I ended up working quite closely with the Council of Churches in Namibia, and so I ended up having a close relationship with the other church leaders there as well, particularly the Anglican and Catholic church leaders, in addition to the Lutheran ones. And my official role was to serve as a legal advisor for the Lutheran bishops. So I would try to inform myself well of the process of the UN transition, of the preparations for the election itself, and then after that for the Constituent Assembly, for the drafting of the Constitution and so forth. I would write memos to the Lutheran bishops recommending actions that the church should take there, and the information I provided was one of the bases of information that the bishops relied upon as they made their public statements or as they made their interventions with the UN or with the South African occupiers or with foreign diplomatic missions who were there. And then, during my work, I spent a lot of time with with church people, with some of the lawyers in Namibia, with people in the UN Transition Assistance Group, and then also traveling around the country. And one of the real privileges of being there on behalf of the church was that entree that I had. And it could have been very different as a white American foreigner in that place. It would have been very easy for people just to treat me politely but not to say anything. But because I was there with the church, working on behalf of the church, and with the introduction of the church, I was able to win the confidence of many people and gather lots of information that was very helpful in the process that would not have been gathered otherwise. It was quite interesting that even the door of the UN Special Representative, Marty Ahtisaari, was always open, and we were on a first-name basis, and he and his key staff would look forward to the weekly reports that I would be writing up of my impressions and so forth. And that was part of this effort that the church could accomplish there because of the important role of the Lutheran Church in Namibia.
And which role played actually this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Played it a decisive role in this transition process?
It did indeed, and particularly in the formulation of the Open Letter of 1971. There must have been a very creative and fruitful intellectual time at the Paulinum Lutheran Seminary in the little backwater village of Ochimbingwe in Namibia, when the professors and the students there were studying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as part of their Christian ethics class, and then compared the provisions of the Universal Declaration against the reality of the South African rule in Namibia, and kept saying, is this rule right? Is this rule justified? Nope, it violates that provision. No, it violates this provision. No, it violates that provision. And it became pretty clear. So the Universal Declaration then became the kind of measure against which to assess the morality of the South African rule in Namibia. And it was the church who gave the leadership in that way.